Right. Welcome, everyone. This is the first of a two-part series. Today, you'll hear from a panel of experts on recruitment in India. Throughout the session, we welcome you to use the chat function as well as the Q&A as you wish. I'm Rilla, and on behalf of CIALFO, I'm pleased to welcome our expert panel moderated by Clay Hensley. Clay, over to you.
Thank you, Rilla. What a privilege to be working with this dream team of panelists and with my CIALFO colleagues. Rilla and my colleague Vanessa have done a great job, as well as our other colleagues, in preparing this deck and promoting the webinar. And so without further ado, I'd love for you guys, everyone in the audience, to use the chat to ask questions, but also, if you're comfortable, introduce yourself, tell us where you're logging in from, what university or what institution you represent, and thoughts about recruiting in this very dynamic, diverse, demographically dynamic space. So how we plan to use this time, this is our agenda. We'll have a brief welcome, context and introductions, but first I will allow my incredible panel to introduce themselves, to tell their own story. After that, we will have a discussion centered on 4 topics, loosely following the enrollment channel. And last, we will have open discussion, questions and answers, ending at the 50-minute mark. With that wrap up and close, you will get a copy of the deck. With that, let's do some introductions, and let's start with Ruby. Ruby.
Thanks so much, Clay. Thank you, CIALFO, for hosting us. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. My name is Ruby Bhattacharya. I currently serve as the Director of Recruitment and Selection at Barnard College. Barnard College is the liberal arts and science college for women within Columbia University in New York City. In my role as director, I oversee our domestic and international recruitment and admissions processes. So delighted to be talking through a little bit of that background with you today. But I've been at Barnard now for 5 years, but I've been working in international admissions for the last almost 12 years. Prior to being at Barnard, I was at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, which is my alma mater. That's where I studied, where I also recruited for India during my time at Swarthmore. After Swarthmore, I earned a master's degree at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in higher education, and then started at Barnard just after finishing at Harvard. For me, the other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about is that my family does come from India. I was born in the United States. I'm the first in my family. I'm part of the first generation of my family to attend college here in the States, first US citizen within our family. But my parents both grew up in India, attended college in India. My father came to the US as an international student to complete an MBA. And so higher education, particularly the connection between India and the US, is something that is very, very deeply personal to me. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that I'm very much Indian American, and that I very proudly wear my Indian identity, but recognizing very much that I was born here in the US and have been educated here in the States. So delighted to be connecting with everybody here today.
Thank you, Ruby. Satyajit.
Thanks, Clay. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're all joining from. I'm Satya Datagupta. I'm the Chief Enrollment Officer, Senior Vice Chancellor for Enrollment at Northeastern University. I oversee enrollment for all of our campuses, ranging from obviously in Boston to San Francisco, San Jose, most recently acquired the merger we had with the Mills College in Oakland, Toronto, Vancouver, London, Arlington. Really happy to be here. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from Mumbai, India. I came to this country at the age of 17 to pursue an undergrad degree, and never went back, if you will, to pursue the so-called American dream. My entire career has been in higher education. I worked at Minnesota State, where I started my career, 2 liberal arts colleges, DePaul University and Washington College, and 3 research R1 institutions, University of Rochester, Tulane, where I was most recently Dean of Admission, and now at Northeastern. India has been a big part of my career in terms of recruitment. At Northeastern, we have the highest number of F1 sponsored students, welcoming over 5,000 Indian students this fall alone. Very excited to be part of this panel and contribute where I can. So thank you for having me, Clay and CIALFO.
Thank you, Satya. I've worked with Satya for a very long time, first starting at Rochester, and then I also share a city with Ruby based in New York, a different borough, but a different city. Let's move on to Pooja. Pooja, tell us your story.
A very good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be here with this panel, and thank you so much to the CIALFO team for organizing this event. Now, my name is Pooja Iyer, and I'm the Associate Director at CIALFO. I'm based out of Bangalore, India. In the context of international education, I like to describe myself as a global citizen because I have lived, worked, and studied in the US, in Germany, in UK, and in Nigeria over the span of multiple years. So I think the value that each of these experiences has brought to me has been tremendous. And I think for most students who are looking to seek studying abroad or looking at international avenues, this is a huge component of why they make that decision to go ahead. Now, in my previous role, I was in IEC and I ran a company. I was the founder called Aspire. I have worked as a career mentor and a college application specialist with thousands of students across India, and a lot of deep insights into what exactly are the key fears or motivators that really make students and parents take their higher education decisions. So really looking to explore more about this in the conversation going ahead. Thank you so much, and over to you, Clay.
Thank you. And John, you and I have also worked together a very long time. Let's talk about your journey and your connection to India as well.
Sure. My name is John Wilkerson, as you can see, I think. I'm the Associate Vice President for International Services at IU, Indiana University. In that role, I oversee international admissions, recruitment, communications, marketing, as well as international student and scholar advising. I started at a small private liberal arts college in central Missouri and have worked subsequently for two major R1 AAU institutions. I started traveling to India in 2006, I believe, and typically have made at least 2 trips per year, absent the COVID void in which we've all emerged. I also serve in several leadership positions with volunteer organizations, and pertinent to this conversation, I serve on the board with IC3, the International College and Career Counseling Movement. We have a global gateway office in Delhi, Indiana does, that we use not so much for recruitment, but for parental student engagement, scholar exchange, research, things like that.
Thank you, John. Yes, Indiana has long time had that deep diplomatic and people-to-people exchange related to India. When I first started working in India, and John and I both were part of the founding of IC3, have also worked with a group called TIC, where we help with their professional learning events, including pre-conferences to their annual conferences, to help counselors better understand how to guide students to the US. Now, I will try to be very quick in terms of giving some brief context. So I'll bulldozer over some of this content and apologize in advance for that, but I really want to privilege and highlight our panelists and the conversation and insights that will come from their strong, authentic, and deep insights. Our goals today would be to define and explore opportunities ahead for engaging with students, their families, their counselors in schools. So these full communities in the world's largest democracy, India. We want to connect the dots between diverse student decision-making patterns, especially across key Indian regions, the states and municipalities, and also the preferred disciplines and how that may change moving forward. Identify actionable insights and evidence-based best practices to help you understand the market and to navigate the road ahead to exceed your goals in the country. Now, the preponderance of students coming to the US derives from only a handful of countries, and India has emerged just behind China in undergraduate. Now, and it looks like this year, across all student levels, India will surpass China, according to recent visa figures. This rebound that's happening throughout the world, I should say, with the exception being China, which seems to be declining. But it's not just India growing, but India by far is the biggest surge. And part of this may be due to the Biden-Harris effect, some other more welcoming policies, and some competition with other countries, particularly the UK, where the UK might not be as attractive, so the US is taking advantage of that post-Brexit. We'll see if that continues. After years of, and I want to highlight my friend's Karen Fisher's article that was published last week that did showcase recent visa figures. Now note that visa figures they're F1 visas, but they don't disaggregate by academic level. So it's a little bit noisy, but it does show that the number of students coming to the US will increase, but the plummeting that's occurring in China is pretty stark. And even though we all expected a leveling out, I don't think we expected this precipice of drop. Now, I mentioned that the growth of new student visas has increased slightly, which is a very positive sign. However, the record growth from India is quite stark and striking, and that's one thing that we'll be talking about. According to CIALFO data, the largest number of students applying to the US are from the states in the West and in the south of India, so Satya, areas which you are very familiar with. I believe you grew up in Mumbai, but also traditionally coming to the US, the NCR, the National Capital Region, with Delhi, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh being very strong there. So not only are applications rising, but also the average number of apps per student are rising. Again, this is proprietary data or unique data to CIALFO, with almost 12 applications per student. Now, when you compare that to the US or compare it to even other countries, that's particularly high. In the US, the average is much, much, much lower. And so the CIALFO data is a promising sign for continued growth in India. Regarding majors, STEM degrees, not surprisingly, especially computer science, engineering, and biotech majors, are currently the most popular disciplines chosen when students inventory their interest within the CIALFO platform. This is indicated by India-based students in CIALFO platform. Now, overall in CIALFO, these are also majors popular elsewhere, but it's particularly striking in India. Some good news for those of you who aren't as strong in STEM, social sciences, especially business, econ, psych, poli-sci, also international relations are growing, and interdisciplinary models. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. Students mentioned design thinking and innovation is something they're very interested in. Now, that certainly points towards STEM, but doesn't have to be. But these are gaining traction. The states that are receiving the most applications and matriculations, again, as indicated by CIALFO's unique data set. Not surprisingly, California is top, our biggest country, our biggest state. Massachusetts behind that, which could be a little bit surprising, but so many strong institutions in that state. New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana is right there following that, all of the other states. But we are seeing very strong growth from India, going to almost every state, but those would be the strongest. And although U.S. Although U.S. R1 institutions, so research institutions where, John, Satya, most of your time has been spent at those institutions. Those institutions receive by far the most number of applications. Ruby, I wanted to call out that liberal arts colleges, those with the Carnegie Code, baccalaureate colleges in the arts and sciences also do very well, but have a particularly strong yield overall, not quite what the R1 institutions are, but stronger than that next level of doctoral degree institutions, even though they don't receive as many applications, they receive more matriculations, again, from the CALFO platform. There are, we'll talk about this in the discussion, the US will need to attract these students, meet them where they are, because with the dollar being so strong, and with India being a very cost-sensitive market, tuition will be seen as something as a barrier. Also, the US doesn't have the type of articulation between visas that other countries, particularly Canada and also Australia does. So this is something also financial aid allocation will be very important. But good news is that it does seem that the US has been resilient during this pandemic, as it has been in past pandemics, and other things that have prevented student mobility. That does seem to be coming back. So now we'll move to our discussion centered on these 4 topics. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can fully see our panelists. And the first question I would like to kick off the conversation in the section titled Reimagining Your Outreach to India. I'll start with you, Satya. Why has India emerged as the most dynamic center of undergraduate students from your experience? Tell us about that, Satya.
Yeah, thank you, Clay. And this is not a surprise that India has emerged and will continue, in my opinion, to be one of the top nations, if not the top nation, to send undergraduate students and graduate students, frankly, to the United States. So if you think about India's history and having been a colony of the British, there's a lot of things that were not right about that. But I always say the 2 gifts that they left India were cricket and English. And I think that Indians just growing up, we're very familiar with the language, and it's the desire to have a better life in some ways, and being driven is part of our sort of ethos, if you will. And I can speak from that from personal experience and my own story, having come to America when I was 17. But I think the 3 factors that I think are impacting this sort of steep growth, and that'll continue. First is just sheer volume. You have every year close to 65 to 70 million students graduating. So if you can take even 1% of that, that's where you get the numbers here. So the sheer volume is there, and then the growth of populations beyond what used to be the metro cities, if you will. So outside of Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, Bangalore, and Chennai, you now have a lot of cities that are drawing populations that are sending students abroad. So you have sheer growth in a qualified number of students who don't have enough spots to be educated in India at the type of institutions that sometimes they want to be at. That's one. Second one is, yes, the dollar is strong and continues to be strong, but the rise in income of the average Indian family has gone up 8 times over the last 3 years. That says a lot about the buying power of the audience that you're recruiting. They might not be able to afford a full tuition, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 per year, but the buying power has gone up. So you have sheer volume, you have an increase in buying power. And then finally, something that I never had when I was 17 is counseling, and the idea that you can go to the United States after high school. So movements like the IC3, just awareness of counseling in high schools, where you have counselors, both independent but also in-house counselors, telling students about options beyond just staying in India, beyond just going to America for grad school. I think undergrad is now going to become an area that you will see a lot of growth over the next several years, in my opinion. So I think when you bring all of those factors together, despite India being a country that was slow to the undergraduate market, if you will, a lot of work has been done over the last several years with a lot of US universities visiting. And then when you overlay all of these 3 factors, I think that's the stage that's being set. And I think we're just getting started and scratching the surface of what India can be in terms of a market for growth for undergraduate opportunities in the coming years.
Well, and Satya, with that transition of being more of a grad, particularly master's, school market, where employability, affordability, because many of those degrees may have had some more subsidizing, whereas at the undergraduate space, there's some. But could you talk a little bit about how Northeastern positions itself related to that employability piece that seems to be a very strong piece of decision making by Indian students? Satya.
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. It's a really good question, right? So it's a lot of this is about return on investment. If I'm spending my money, and a lot of families that send their and it is families because parents play a big role in this, send their child to the United States is so they can have a better life. It's so that they can get a return on the investment that's sort of lifelong. So Northeastern success in India has been driven by the fact that obviously we're an R1 institution that's a top quality institution, but the co-op program, the idea that you can work while you study and you don't have to pay tuition during those 6 months and you get paid through your CPT and then eventually your OPT is something that's very attractive to families. I've talked to many Indian parents who say being happy is very important, but I also want my child, my son, daughter, he, she, or they, to have the ability to be employable at the end of their 4 years. So therefore, the co-op, which is, we have 3,000 partners. Every student completes at least 1 up to 3 co-ops by the time they graduate, resonates really strongly with the audience.
So John and Ruby, now your institutions, John, a lot of opportunity for undergraduate research at Indiana. Ruby, incredible experiential learning opportunities at your institution. I'd like for you guys to jump in to talk about how you might position yourself in a different way than, say, Northeastern's co-op program allows. John and Ruby, please jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. As you mentioned, yes, we do have significant opportunities for research and experiential learning at IU. And interestingly, even within our international population, we see a significant number of students who go abroad for internships. So while they are studying abroad in the US, they also go abroad. Some of them choose to go back to India if that is ultimately where they want to be employed. That provides a great leg up for students in that regard. The other thing that we offer are, as you mentioned, Clay, those deep connections within the country, I think are incredibly important. We have a very active student and alumni association. Two of our largest alumni chapters are in Mumbai and Delhi. And the engagement that we see through that Global Gateway office and interacting with both prospective but also current and returning students is incredibly beneficial. We host, in partnership with several of our Big Ten colleagues, we host an several actually, international career fairs as well. So we're not just introducing companies and places of work to students within the US, we're also doing that abroad. So that employability factor is, as mentioned, really a vital outcome that students are looking for. The thing that we've seen in India as well is while the typical Indian student and family tend to remain very rankings conscious, there's a savviness about how those rankings are consumed. And so they pay very close attention to program rankings, magnet programs in particular, and look at job placement rates, things like that, as part of their search. And in contrast to China, which is also incredibly rankings conscious, as you mentioned, Clay, we've seen quite a bit of spread that's been occurring in terms of areas of academic interest, and not so concentrated in 1 or 2 disciplines, and that I think has also really provided some breadth and depth to their university experiences in the States. But this is, of course, is a viewpoint in Indiana, sorry, in Bloomington. Ruby, I would be very interested in contrast to how are things in Manhattan?
Absolutely, John. And much of what you said certainly does apply as well to us in terms of prospective Indian families wanting to know information about outcomes. I think definitely if you are rethinking your recruitment strategy in India, and certainly happy to speak to that more, know your outcomes and be prepared to talk about them in depth because you will get a lot of questions about it. In terms of how I'm positioning Barnard in speaking with families, I think before I can even introduce the idea of Barnard as the women's college affiliated to Columbia or Barnard being in Manhattan or New York City, I do start with a very fundamental conversation around liberal arts and what does it mean to be at a liberal arts and science college. When I have my presentations in India, I will speak to families and very much ask the question, yes, Barnard is a liberal arts and science college. Have we heard of this before? And most will say, raise their hand that yes, I've heard of liberal arts before. And then I pose the question, what does that mean? What does a liberal arts college mean? No hands up. And so I think it's really important that for all institutions in the States, frankly, not just the small liberal arts colleges, but recognizing to a certain degree the 4,000 or 5,000 higher ed institutions across the States all practice some iteration of liberal arts. It's really important to make sure that we're bridging that knowledge gap, because I think it is so fundamentally very, very different than what families may be experiencing in higher education in India, in the UK, in many other countries around the world. So really having that conversation. What does it mean to be at a liberal arts and science institution? Yes, you're going to have a major. Yes, you're going to learn that in depth. But at the same time, this notion that you are taking classes outside of your major and what the value in that is, not just in terms of what is that going to mean for you in terms of your bottom line and your paycheck out of school, but really talking about the intellectual experience, the level of growth that we're talking about that students experience, really emphasizing too, that in the States, in American higher education, this is not by and large, not just a transactional experience. You go to class, you get credits, one day you graduate. We're also talking about robust experiences outside of the classroom. John touched on internships. We're talking about residential life and all of the things that come along with that, and really thinking about how we're helping students to grow inside and outside of the classroom, not just, what class am I going to take? Am I getting from point A to point B and then ultimately getting a paycheck? Really helping families to understand how we're helping their children to grow in many different aspects, both intellectually, socially, but preparing them not just for that first job out of graduation, but truly for a lifelong career. So I ensure that I would say for a lot of my conversations with families, really reading the room and understanding where is their level of knowledge in terms of just fundamentally understanding what is liberal arts. And then as we're thinking then about the admissions process, how do they then articulate, is this actually a fit for me? Because there are a lot of students for whom, personally, I'm biased, I think everyone could benefit from a liberal arts and science experience, but not every student is necessarily the fit for it, and not everyone is looking for that. And that's a really important conversation to ensure that families have had. What am I looking for? As opposed to just, I want something highly ranked, I want something very elite, but really, what experience are you looking for? And then I'm able to launch into talking about the experience that we offer at Barnard. I think safety is certainly another question that I think is coming up more and more, particularly as a university in New York City, in the US. I think certainly questions around gun violence, racism, these are all conversations I have always had in India, but certainly more and more, particularly being at a women's college. I think this is a question we get, recognizing that families are sending their daughters halfway across the world to a country where they may or may not know anyone. And so they have questions. I think for many, they find the small liberal arts environment appealing because knowing that their child will not be lost in a crowd of people is something that I definitely hear about a lot from parents. But on the flip side, I think the women's college piece too, being in a women-centered environment that is focused on empowerment, I think for a lot of parents, that is an exciting notion. But recognizing too that for a lot of the students that would be considering Barnard, the way they navigate spaces as women in India is very different. The patriarchy is certainly alive and well here in the States, but also very, very alive and well in the US, in India. And that's something that I think that is often a cultural barrier that we're having to overcome too. But parents take a lot of comfort in feeling that there's a sense of safety that they associate with a women's college experience, where they feel that comfort of there's going to be a sense of familiarity, but at the same time, time, I encourage them to think about, no, this is an environment where your daughter's actually going to be pushed outside of her comfort zone in so many ways. But at the same time, I think parents feel a sense of security knowing that they'll be part of a tight-knit community where people will be looking out for them. So I would say safety, security, or other questions, other concerns very much on parents' minds in India.
Thank you, Ruby. And so one key takeaway that I was listening for is that you're engaging with the full family, not just with the individual student in the way that you might in the US. Pooja, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. Here, I also heard Ruby talk about that moving or shifting from the transactional view to a full trajectory of life cycle of learning, and that interdisciplinary nature that really hits an intercultural competence or intercultural understanding. And Pooja, what advice would you give based on those factors and families you're dealing with?
So a lot of times what we see, Clay, is when you look at students who are studying in India, a lot of responses that we get from graduates is though they have gained some amount of domain knowledge, they are not exactly employable, correct? If you look at corporate India, the corporate world that's coming back and saying, okay, great, they have completed a course in XYZ domain, but these students are not employable. And this comes from a lack of practical experience and exposure, correct? Though there are some colleges now that are incorporating this, more of the new age colleges, I would say for the most part, this is something that is definitely currently lacking. And also one of the primary factors where a lot of parents and students are looking at universities abroad, correct? At the end of the day, they need to know, and there being that focus on what happens once I complete my graduation, right? What happens once I complete my post-graduation? Am I then employable and able to get the best opportunities possible? So that's a component that definitely comes in. And the second thing, just kind of adding to what Ruby was saying, is I think a lot of times we need to understand that the strategy that we're going to employ to talk to an Indian audience is a little different from what would work in, different countries, right? So it's not a one size fits all approach. You can't take, a marketing or an approach strategy or an entry strategy that has worked in one particular country and say, okay, hey, let me just kind of replicate that here, because like we were talking about yesterday, in India, you are not just talking to the student or selling to the student, but you're selling to the entire family, right? The family is very invested in the entire decision-making process. And this is something that, universities need to be mindful of when they're having these conversations or planning their India strategy. Over to you.
Ruby, I'm gonna turn back to you as we kind of move into this next topic. But and you've hit upon some of this very, very succinctly, Ruby. But I want to give you a chance to underline some of those key things. So as you talk about leveraging India's incredible diversity and that dynamicism within the country, the states, the regions, the municipalities, and even the schools that you're dealing with all have their distinctions. How do you tailor your recruiting approach to these different sectors in this dynamic country? Ruby.
Thanks, Clyde. I will elevate again what Pooja was just saying. I think it's really important as U.S. admissions officers, as we are thinking about recruiting in India, I would really encourage you to think about your India strategy quite differently than you do, certainly your domestic recruitment strategy, but even your international strategy in other countries. I think India, it's a very, very distinct market, and there are a lot of differences, and a lot of it is very much rooted in cultural competency and on a lot of different levels. Certainly, I think the family recruitment piece is huge. It's a very, very different approach in India. Certainly, you see it in other parts of the world too, where parents are involved, but recognize in India that the primary market that you're actually speaking with our parents. Just the other day, I remember in one of the admissions social media groups, people were talking about how frustrating it is that parents come to visits, domestically. In India, you should expect to see parents at all of your visits and any programming. And it's not serving your institution well to be excluding parents. So I would highly, highly encourage you, whether you are in a national curriculum school, an IB school, AP school, whatever it may be across India, that you are including parents, because this is very much a parent conversation. You can have a student be completely excited about your institution, but if you haven't engaged the parents, you've achieve nothing in that space. And so really making sure that parents are a part of your recruitment strategy, regardless of the type of school that you're recruiting in. I think the cultural competency piece also comes in terms of understanding the lay of the land. There are a variety of curricula available to students in India, but by and large, you will actually be interacting with students at national curricula schools. And I think we're seeing part of the growth that we're seeing in India. A lot of the students are coming from students who are doing CBSE or they're doing ISC, whatever it may be. And so being cognizant of that diversity, I think previously it was very often you saw our colleagues mostly recruiting in Mumbai, in Delhi, but really stepping outside of that as well, realizing that India is a huge country with incredible diversity, so many languages, so many cultures, ensuring that you are aware of that and ensuring that as you are recruiting that you are honoring that. I know that we've been fortunate at Barnard. I recall just a couple of years ago among our students who were enrolling, we had, I think, at least 11, 12 cities represented within India. And so recognizing that maybe just 10 years ago, students were by and large just coming from 2 cities. And so it's been really exciting to see just that incredible diversity reflected within our community. I think the other thing in terms of thinking about your recruitment, just a couple of things also come to mind, Clay. There is definitely right now, and I think that the pandemic has made this worse. There are a lot of misconceptions, unfortunately, throughout India. I've noticed this not just in particular cities, but truly throughout India regarding the process. And unfortunately, as a result of the misconceptions, there's been a lot of fear mongering, unfortunately, among a lot of bad players in India. So there's a lot of information available to families in India about the university admissions process. But I would hazard to guess that most of it is wrong. And that's been the unfortunate reality that we're seeing, is that parents and students, a lot of their anxiety derives from information that is just completely incorrect. And so I would encourage you, if you're not already on the ground in India, it is essential that you be there to be able to do some of that myth busting in person, whether it's addressing what liberal arts is or isn't. That one of the things I'm up against when I'm defining, helping families to understand what it is, parents say, but I don't want my child, painting, poetry. That's not what I want them to do. And you're really having to, really get down there and explain, let me actually talk about what liberal arts is. I think right now there's still very much a belief, especially in this test optional world that we're in right now, that quantity is the goal here, that let me just submit more awards, more certificates, more tests, that these are the things that are going to stand out. And really, I think academic research is one of those right now. That is the big thing in India, where families are being told that no, students without research outside of school are not competitive for admission to our institutions, and families are spending exorbitant amounts of money to attain research opportunities that frankly, that is not our expectation. And so I think I really encourage you to be in these spaces to be able to help families, first of all, to help just mitigate some of that anxiety, but help to put just ensure that families are getting official information. I'd say there's a lot of confusion around what a scholarship is versus what need-based financial aid is. And so having those transparent conversations, knowing, again, this was rooted in cultural competency. In India, yes, it's very much you're recruiting the family. Within the family dynamic, though, conversations about money are not happening. And so really ensuring that you are encouraging families to be very transparent with their children about what their means actually are. And so that is something that culturally is just not happening naturally, that families will say, we'll figure it out. We'll make whatever we need to do to make this education possible. But recognizing that, really encouraging families that you need to have an honest conversation around money and what resources are available. The other thing I want to make sure that I mention, Clay, is around as admissions officers, those who are making decisions about who the traveler should be to India, thinking about your recruitment and your staffing. I think it's really important, somebody who is willing to lean into these cultural competency pieces that we've identified, but additionally recognizing that India recruitment is very unlike, that travel is very different from travel you would be experiencing in other parts of the world. That yes, you can plan and plan, but it's not uncommon for plans to not quite work out in India, just given the inherent, just
got it.
lovely chaos of the country. And
having that flexibility, that
absolutely
improvisation,
being flexible, leaning into, just having staff who are flexible, adaptable, being able to think on their feet, making quick decisions, because that is often happening more frequently while traveling in India than in other spaces. I would say, as I think about this incoming generation of admissions officers, ensuring that is not, you don't want somebody who's easily overwhelmed or, that can become very anxious in those situations. situations. And I think for all of us, we all experience some elements of that. But I think at the same time, knowing that on the flip side, there's an incredible opportunity there to learn, to engage, to be able to establish a trust with families, with community, with our
Absolutely.
colleagues on the
And to
other side of the desk.
demonstrate that grace that we want in
Oh,
our students.
absolutely.
You know, that
Absolutely.
kind of
And so
openness to learn. Satya, I would want to turn to you real quick before we move on to admission policies. Satya, you know, Ruby made some great points in talking about you know, her approach and at her school. Northeastern, though, has a much larger scale. So as you look, because you're drawing in numbers in that engine that we were talking about, where it's traditionally it is the Delhi capital region and then Mumbai, but now throughout Karnataka, Telangana, you know, and other parts of the South, that real engine of growth, but they might not be as those families, those students, those counselors as well versed. How do you cut through, streamline, clarify? Could you talk a little bit about that, Satya?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, Ruby, John, and Pooja, for your insights. This is incredibly helpful, just even for me to hear from some of my colleagues here. You know, I've told my team that every Indian student is different from the other. The level of access that a student has in India varies greatly depending on just the region you live in, and even in a city, the school you go to. Not to assume things that they know what credits mean, what the tuition is, what, like Ruby said, what the scholarshiping strategy is, and what that means, but also to be patient, that they will ask a lot of questions, right? And I think they're just trying to ascertain that they're making the right decision on their end. For Northeastern, what's worked, Clay, is really a multi-pronged strategy. We have people that work with us, for us, that live in India, that recruit on ground. We have people that represent us at the undergraduate and the graduate level, and then have people from Northeastern who travel there. So for us, what's worked is a multi-pronged strategy where you're meeting the student where they are, and fully understanding that the ability to pay is not the only thing that dictates who we're trying to recruit. Because in India itself, every different state can feel like it's a completely different nation altogether because of the culture and the language and the practices. So just knowing that you can have a one strategy fits all even in India, it has been very important for us.
Thank you. And John, I really love that phrase that Satya just uttered, meeting students where they are. And I had meeting and admitting students where they are. How do you, in this test optional environment, I know Indiana, which went test optional before the pandemic and has really doubled down on it, that kind of flexibility, that nimbleness. Which policies did you implement during COVID beyond that and that had the biggest impact, and how do you really make sure that continues to be successful, John?
Truly, the largest impact was making that shift to test optional, and having spent 2+ years of research and preparation that was fortuitous. As the pandemic hit, we were already well positioned to accurately assess students' abilities. So the admission decisions that we were making, we felt were very informed, and we were better, I think, positioned to have conversations with counselors, with parents, students about what that assessment looked like. And to Ruby's point, being very in tune with credentials, with curricula, saying to parents, hey, we get it that your 11th grade marks are probably not going to be as high as others. We know why that is. Doesn't mean they should be, but we understand. So having that kind of savviness, I think, was incredibly helpful. Also, just the reassurances that we were able to provide in terms of safety on campus and access to health services and things like that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we had tremendous assistance through the consular services in India, and the massive pushes that they made to really prioritize international student visas and allowing the opportunity for students to come to the States. I think that is very important. And then continuing with the outcome portion, utilizing the domestic career services in partnership with our office to ensure that students had access to and opportunities to utilize the optional practical training experiences. And many of those programs are STEM optional, so several years of in-country training, which gets to the employability piece, but also to the financial piece, allowing students to recoup some of their funds. And many of them, we've seen a large increase in subsidized loans that students are taking out in India as well. So we're also finding that as part of the conversation, much as we do with domestic students and domestic recruitment, having to have those conversations about what should you expect to be paying for in terms of cost of attendance, and what do some of those loans look like? What are you getting yourself into? I think has been very important, and is a trust building exercise.
That is, and I think the OPT piece in particular, but also many of the other drivers you mentioned, we could do whole sessions on. I do want to double down a bit and bring Pooja, Satya, and Ruby back into the conversation about how you train your staff. You mentioned, John, being savvy about the local board exams, as well as AS and A levels, IB, that are very common there. Ruby, I think you made a very strong point earlier, but I want you to highlight that again, that students, they don't need things outside of their own academic record, right? That Barnard knows what to do with that. Could you talk a little bit about that, Ruby?
Absolutely. This is definitely something I feel we're very up against as a field, not just in India, but certainly I think in a lot of places now. But I think it's really important where we, as those who train staff members, are talking about the differences across curricula and ensuring that we are knowledgeable about curricular changes, about how grading is done, about how the exams are marked, and really communicating to families that we do have an understanding of this. I think there's a lot, again, I will say the word fear. There's a lot of fear that we don't, and therefore students are feeling pressured to do things that seem, frankly, quote unquote, American, where they are taking a whole host of AP exams. Students in India have very limited access, minimal access to AP courses. So students in India really should not be sitting for these exams, but they're feeling compelled to do so because they want to be able to demonstrate that they understand that they will be capable of performing in our classrooms. And so it's really essential that we are communicating that we recognize, for example, the rigors of CBSE, that a family should not feel that they have to really go out of their way financially to make sure that their students are at an AP or IB school, that's not at all an expectation, and that we do have wonderfully strong students on our school at all of our institutions who've come from national curriculum schools, and that there's no expectation that they step outside of that. I think this is where also the academic research trend is building, where people are feeling that they need to show that they have these abilities outside of the classroom. And I think for us, it really comes down to us demonstrating that we have a strong knowledge of the rigors of their curricula. I would also emphasize, I think Satya pointed to this earlier, about English language. I think English language proficiency is another issue. I encourage my colleagues out there, if you are requiring English proficiency exams of students in India, I'm going to ask you why, and really think about why are you requiring that? You're thinking about the barriers that puts in front of students, and really thinking about the messaging that sends to students most of whom are educated entirely in English in a country where English is one of many, many official languages. And so there are things that I would say are really important that we are communicating. We have knowledge, and again, I will emphasize cultural competency.
And Satya, as we close out this section, and I know Northeastern, again being, you're having that scale, but also some ability to improvise and innovate. You've considered even offering credit for CBSE. I know that this is a movement in which CSUs, the UCs, and Arizona State are also involved, but Northeastern is starting to have a leadership role there. Could you, within that overall theme of meeting students where they are, could you talk a little bit about Northeastern's approach there?
Yeah, I think life as a 17-year-old is hard enough, where you don't want to add, further roadblocks, right? So I think you have to lead from the front and say, here's a policy change that is directed at you, 17-year-old student, because how much can a 17-year-old do, right? I mean, if you think about it, sometimes we're asking them to have cured cancer by the time they apply for college. And I think that's sort of the mindset for some of these students. And you just reassure them that, hey, what you're doing in high school is enough. And therefore, I think giving credit for some level of achievement in CBSE and acknowledging that the work that they've done counts for something, takes off some of the pressure. And then also in terms of test optional, I think for a lot of the students, it's the proof, right, that we accept half our students were test optional and that you actually are not disadvantaged by not taking the test. And the test is really not a true ability it's not a true reflection of your ability. Don't take the test 5 times just so you can get it to a certain number, right? And push yourself. So you have to also understand that I think these 17-year-olds are sometimes 18-year-olds are sort of drowning in information, starving for wisdom. So giving them the 4 or 5 things, which is telling them here's what you need to do and then following through. Otherwise, the policy in India has always been, and I was a victim of this, is more is better. Is the more you do, the better it is, and that's not always true. It's about quality balanced with quantity, not just doing every activity that's thrown at you, and really in many ways giving up what are some of the best years of your life.
Thank you, Satya. And I recognize that you have a prior commitment. And so I want to thank you for your time on this panel. We're going to audible and extend the conversation a little bit to answer some of the questions we've seen in the chat, but I wanted to acknowledge, Satya, that you had a hard stop and needed to go. So thank you for your contribution to this panel. Pooja, as we close out and then start to move to questions, I really wanted to ask you, what advice do you give our higher ed community, with your deep knowledge of this sector, as they plan to engage students and family in India? And then we'll move on to questions. Pooja.
Sure. So essentially, if you look at the demographic timeline of the youthful population in South Asia, right, the pace of social change that's there, and South Asia's position in the new economic order, there is a huge mass of latent talent and potential that's there, right? So how this is actually managed is very, very important for universities having these conversations or looking at India as a market. So if you look at it, about 18% of the over 900,000 international students studying in the US come from India alone, right? Over 160,000 international students have contributed to about 6.2 billion to the US economy. So when we look at these numbers, we really understand that it's very imperative for us to have an absolutely focused strategy. And at the end of the day, when everyone is vying for the same student population or set of students, it's not just about who comes out with the best advertisement or marketing campaign, but more in terms of collating all of the information that my esteemed panelists have put together. We're saying we need a feasibility and strategic roadmap for university, correct? You have to systematically study the Indian market. It's not just about saying, okay, India strategy and how, as Satya is no longer here, but he was also mentioning that every city or every state has a different focus on programs and a different set of things that students are looking for, correct? So you even need to fine tune your strategy based on what areas you're targeting and what programs you're really offering in your courses, correct? Coming to Ruby's point of, safety and engagement to kind of set that tone, engaging with families is imperative. So a lot of universities, even like the UPenn, for instance, has like an orientation program where they're actually sitting down, talking to them about what's happening, where you're looking at multiple parameters, including like the country image, right? Because a lot of times a decision is not purely based on that one particular course that you're going to be doing. There are multiple factors that are kind of coming into it. So even in terms of the country image that is there, that is created, that becomes really important for us to look at in that sense. And a positive program evaluation. Now, why is a student from India really looking to go abroad and study, right? The breadth of courses that are available is a lot larger. The potential to have multiple majors and minors that are combined to really kind of identify that specific course, or like Ruby was saying, a liberal arts education, right, which is truly interdisciplinary in the sense of the value that it's bringing to the table, becomes really important. So I think these are some of the key factors that universities have to really highlight upon and kind of bring to the whole conversation with the students and parents to say, hey, you know what, it's not just one aspect that you're looking at, and we understand it. And even if we're saying that the education cost is at this price, we're really going out there to create a safe environment, to create affordability, and to really cater to what you are looking for.
Wonderful. And Pooja, CIALFO primarily, well, not primarily, exclusively works with students in schools. John, Ruby, there's a very good question from our friend Eddie West from San Diego. Eddie is asking, for those that aren't in schools, or at least not the that you're recruiting from, but that are using what he calls agents or sub-agents, what is your advice there? I'll start with John.
Our advice is be smart, frankly, and not to get too far down, because this could be a whole session in itself as well. But there truly is a difference between an independent education consultant and a commission-based agent. And so, as Ruby mentioned, there are unfortunately bad actors, and I think my advice would be to speak with a family who has worked with several families, hopefully, who have worked with those IECs previously, so that you have some point of direct reference. Also, I think it is very helpful to find out what professional organizations they hold membership in. Are they part of ISEF, for example? There are organizations that set ethical standards for IECs, for commission-based agents as well, including International ACAC.
Right.
So I think looking for those affiliations and getting very secure references would be my impression.
Ruby, do you have anything to add there?
Sure. I think, again, I just want to emphasize John's point of being smart. And I think being thoughtful about the people with whom you're working. Again, there's so much fear mongering happening. And we're talking about in a community, in a culture where parents are willing to do whatever it is they need to do for their child's education. And I think it's a very bad combination, unfortunately, where these bad actors are really preying, frankly, on the fears of these families. And so encouraging students and families to be smart, I think really elevating that you don't need an IEC, you don't need an agent, that we have plenty of students who've come to our colleges who have not worked, whether it be with a private counselor or at schools where there is no school counselor. I think elevating Education USA and USIEF as also official sources of information on the ground. USIEF is a phenomenal resource in India, and they're available throughout the country. When I am there in India traveling, my colleagues and I that I travel with within our group, we will always do sessions with USIEF. And so that is the arm in India of Education USA, the US India Educational Foundation. And so really encouraging you to reach out to them. They do phenomenal programming. It is very, very active. They are available to meet with students, to advise students. A lot of their programming is free. And so really elevating the work that they are doing. I have also worked with my colleagues at Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago, Barnard. The three of us have done counselor programs where we've also included Education USA advisors in professional development workshops, ensuring that they have the most official information. So the more that we can shine a light on these wonderful free resources, but also official resources, I think it's really important, because we need to drown out what is frankly just noise. It's noise that is creating a lot of fear and anxiety.
Ruby, I would follow up and say we do similar things with our Big Ten colleagues when we recruit, offering those informational sessions where we've adopted a approach in our recruitment of students that we view as service-based. And really the goal is that any conversation we have with any student or parent should be of benefit to that student or parent, regardless of where they enroll. So to Ruby's point, a lot of myth busting and sharing of resources. One of the things that I share when I train, which happens not so much anymore, but when I would train admissions officers, is that if you have a really in-depth conversation with a student and parent, and they leave your table without the name of several other universities that you've suggested on the back of your business card, that's not true admissions counseling. And I think that can sometimes take students and parents aback. But again, where the institutions that are, I think, doing this well are interested in retention, persistence, and attainment, not just getting someone in the door if it's not going to be a successful institution for them.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation and close. You know, what all three of you and Satya before that have all hit on the theme of not going it alone, that the opportunities for partnership, the opportunities for collaboration toward mutual benefit, whether that's through ISEF, whether that's through ERC, you know, if you are using commission-based agents. I'm a huge fan of NACAC and its work, as well as International ACAC as well. But your collaborative like the Big Ten, I'll also call out a plug for some work that CIALFO is doing to offer support and help to universities. And thank John for being on our advisory committee, as well as Satya as well. With that, I want to thank Ruby. I want to thank Pooja. I want to thank John and Satya, as well as Rilla and Vanessa and their CIALFO colleagues for helping us organize this webinar. Also, thank you for our very active audience. Thank you for putting your comments and questions in the chat. We hope this has been helpful, and we want to build on this for other resources and other professional learning that we can provide you. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.